Welcome to the first edition of the new interview series hosted by the UN Women Training Center's Community of Practice. My name is Ria Ligari. I'm a consultant for the Training Center, and this is the first one of the interview series, which we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Lucy Ferguson, who will be speaking to us today about feminist pedagogies and online training for gender equality. And I'm just going to turn to notes. So I should explain before we begin that the COP interview series will feature a range of interviews with experts on topics related to training for gender equality, and it will run from June through to the end of 2017. Interviews will happen every 2 weeks, every second Thursday. Each interview will last about half an hour, and our listeners will have the chance to ask questions at the end of the session. If you'd like to ask questions, you can send them in at any time using the questions tab on the bottom right of the webinar platform. And so we'll try to get through as many of those as possible towards the end of our interview today. So let me introduce our guest for today's interview, who is Lucy Ferguson, Dr. Lucy Ferguson, who's an international consultant and expert in training for gender equality. Lucy has worked extensively on the subject for the UN Women Training Center, for UN Women, and for UNWTO. She's designed innovative online training courses and gender mainstreaming for organizations like the Commonwealth Secretariat. She's also a leading academic in the field of training. She's a research fellow at Madrid's Complutense University. She's a co-editor of the book, The Politics of Feminist Knowledge Transfer, Gender Training and Gender Expertise. And she's a widely published expert on gender and development issues in leading academic journals. Lucy has also most recently prepared a series of working papers for the UN Women Training Center, which many of you might have seen. These are on theories of change, on quality issues, and on feminist pedagogies in training for gender equality. And that's going to be what we're going to talk to her about today. So the Feminist Pedagogies paper, which is online on the UN Women Training Center's website, discusses the application of key feminist pedagogical principles in training before going on to look at how to integrate these principles across all stages of the training cycle, from analysis and planning through to the design and development of a training program, through to its implementation and evaluation. It also presents a statement of pedagogical principles and practices for training. So Lucy, let's begin the interview, and I'd like you please to tell us a little bit more about this paper. What can people expect to find, and how did this paper come about, and how is it structured?
Thanks, Ruya, and thanks everybody who's listening. Thanks very much for inviting me to this informal interview. It's quite a nice environment, and it's a nice way to talk about things and have an open conversation with the people who are participating as well, wherever you are in the world. The working paper series was commissioned by the UN Women Training Center based on a number of virtual dialogues that we did in the community of practice. We also had an expert group meeting in Santo Domingo in August 2015, and really the ideas that came out of those series of processes and meetings and issues that were kind of persistent, stubborn issues within the field. That's how the working paper series was developed. As Ruya said, there are various different working papers. There's also an introductory paper, which is quite useful for kind of tying together the key themes. These are very much working papers. They're papers in process. We hope to put them out there for collective discussion, for debate, and we very much welcome input into how the papers can be improved and where we might take them next. This paper is on feminist pedagogies for training for gender equality, and the idea of the paper really is to try and think through in a theoretical way, first of all, what kinds of pedagogies, what kinds of feminist pedagogies do we need or are useful to help us advance our work in training for gender equality. So the paper starts out by setting out 4 key principles and why they are important and the core of feminist pedagogies, and then the paper moves on to specifically apply these principles, or at least explore how these may be applied in a training scenario, based on the idea really that most work on pedagogies comes from the field of feminist adult education. And I just want to clarify now really that this is a different field in many ways. So while there are some shared aspects and shared components between feminist adult education and women's studies, gender studies, and other disciplines around that. I think there are some qualitative differences between that and training for gender equality, and I'll refer to those throughout our interview today. There's also a separate paper on education and training, trying to kind of map a little bit more and set out a bit more clearly what the differences and similarities between those two fields might be. So I just wanted to put that qualifier in there. So therefore, having said that, the paper tries to look at specifically what are the what would happen in practice applying these principles, and what, if any, specific difficulties might arise in a training scenario that may not really necessarily be relevant in an adult education environment. And then the paper looks at the training cycle, and so in order to be quite practical and to be practically applied, how do we think about integrating these pedagogical principles at different phases of the training cycle? Analysis and planning, design and development, implementation and evaluation. And as Rui already said, we close with a statement on pedagogical principles and practices for training for gender equality. So if you haven't already seen the paper, I invite you to look at it. I'm sure Rui can send the link. And yeah, sorry. So I think, yeah, that's the structure of the paper, and that's kind of the starting point for what we're going to discuss today, I think.
Perfect. Well, the paper is a really insightful one, and I think it deals with a lot of the challenges that apply to feminist pedagogies, especially related to training. And one of the challenges that you raise in the paper, which we found particularly interesting, was the challenge of resisting a single dominant institutionalized narrative, such as, for example, the question of how to define feminist pedagogies without walling off the possibility of multiple feminist pedagogies. Because after all, in training for gender equality, we're interested in participatory knowledge creation and participatory sharing and learning. So we wanted to ask you, what are the principles that you feel are most universal, and why did you include, because there's 4 key principles that are included in the paper. Mm-hmm. So why did you include them? And if you'd like to speak a little bit about what these principles are.
Thanks. Well, first of all, to the point about trying to be inclusive and participatory, I think this is always a challenge when writing as from an elite privileged position with a PhD and working for a UN institution. So it's not always easy to have the level of engagement that we would like, and it's not easy to reach. It's not as easy to reach practitioners as we would hope it was. We've done a lot of work in the CoP of trying to reach people, trying to engage people, trying to bring a more kind of collective, participatory discussion, but there's more work to do, and it's not easy. So, we put the papers out there, and then we hope that they generate discussion. In terms of how to be pluralistic, then the paper embraces a plurality of feminisms, and it also draws on sort of acknowledges the debt to critical pedagogies coming from Frere's work on the pedagogy of the oppressed. It acknowledges the important contribution of Black feminist thought to these feminist pedagogies and what is contributed there. There's also a lot of useful material from masculinity studies, from whiteness studies or anti-racism studies, and there are also useful materials not just from academic literature but from other kinds of adult learning. So a lot of activist work has very useful materials on pedagogies. So in order to try and be as inclusive as possible, we try to review as wide a range of work as possible on feminist pedagogies, and from that draw a kind of together what might be a shared basis of how we understand feminist pedagogical principles. We argue in the paper that the key principles work together towards an overarching goal of transforming patriarchal structures and oppression, which should be at the core of all feminist pedagogical work, and that this work is underpinned by a commitment to feminist critique and a feminist project. So feminist pedagogies view learning through the lens of oppression and attempt to look at racial, sexual and social diversity and inequality. So we set that as the background of how we understand feminist pedagogies, and then we draw to be able to apply it more to practice, we draw 4 specific principles. Participatory learning, and there's something that of course we all, I'm sure none of this is new to anyone, even if you haven't read the paper, because this is the way that we all work as gender trainers, and it's what guides and motivates us. But the idea of the paper is that it's useful to get this written down somewhere, and for people to be able to use it as a basis for their own work, and also to keep the debate going. So we have participatory learning, validation of personal experience, encouragement of social justice, activism and accountability, and 4th, the development of critical thinking and open-mindedness. So the paper's built around these 4 core principles, as I said, underpinned by a commitment to a feminist critique, which is embedded within a feminist project of change.
So I think one of the things that is really part and parcel of a feminist critique would be the challenges also that these principles raise, because no principles are without their own specific challenges. For example, in the paper you mentioned the idea of perhaps sometimes, especially in training scenarios, especially in gender training scenarios, that personal experience, participants' personal experience can come into tension with feminist ideas about gender inequality and patriarchy and subordination. What are some of the ways that you think these can be addressed, these challenges?
I think that is a really important point, and it's perhaps something that we haven't worked on enough in gender training, because I think that the work that draws on the activist feminist work and also academic feminist work, those scenarios are not necessarily the same as the ones that we're faced with as gender trainers. There's a lot of assumptions going on there about participants being open to knowledge, for one thing, particularly on a women's studies or a gender studies course. And there are also within the feminist pedagogies, particularly in terms of the work on the pedagogy of the oppressed, there are the pedagogical tools and methods are often designed to engage with people who are in an underprivileged, oppressed, or structurally disadvantaged position. However, a lot of our work in gender training doesn't really describe it, because a lot of the work as gender trainers is dealing with international institutions, with managers and senior managers working in elite positions, and also often the people working in international organizations are drawn from global elites. So, albeit in an intersectional way. So I think that perhaps this is something that we haven't worked on really enough in gender training. There's the great work on resistances by Emmanuel Lombardo and Lut Megert. Their work on resistances, I think, helps with this, because it sort of says, right, well, we're using all these feminist pedagogical principles, including personal experience, but the personal experience that comes up is in itself demonstrates a strong resistance to the idea of gender equality in implicit and explicit ways. So I think that something that I've been working on recently in the last couple of months is looking at privilege in gender training. And I think this is where this question about personal experience comes in. Again, it depends on the audience. First of all, to explore the power dynamics between and within the trainers and the participants. And then I think an important question here, which is raised by Mukhopadhyay and Wong in their work, is is our job to persuade? Are we trying to persuade them to change their personal experience or perspectives and therefore lead to a certain kind of change, or is it something else? And I still feel that this is a bit intangible, really, what this something else might be. So I think this question of personal experience comes in here. And when I was reading around for this paper, looking at different, for the privilege work that I've been doing, looking at different authors on working on privilege in a pedagogical way, and something that struck me was that this aspect of personal experience, a big part of it is about voice, giving voice to the participants, and that's a key feminist pedagogical principle that fits there with personal experience. However, when we're talking about the privilege, and also particularly working within international institutions where a lot of denial of gender inequality and a lot of denial of the importance of gender inequality goes on, I think that sometimes actually this voice aspect may only get us to a certain point. So and some interesting references which I'll send to you in a minute, because I haven't got it off the top of my head. It's some new research. Perhaps sometimes it's not voice that we need, but yet learning, that helping people learn to listen, especially those who are in the most privileged situations but don't necessarily acknowledge that privilege. So I think this is some of the questions that remain in terms of this thing, thinking about personal experience and how we deal with that personal experience. If that personal experience is based in privilege and a denial of privilege, then where do we go from there?
I agree. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I think it's a very interesting idea. I think that was raised a bit in the last webinar we had for our last virtual dialogue, just this idea that are we dealing with people who are disenfranchised, like, for example, women in communities, where we're trying to give them a voice and trying to bring about women's empowerment, or are we dealing with people who are in organizations who are quite privileged, and we may have to ask them to reassess the gender construction of the self, which is something that Claudie Bouet, one of our speakers, spoke a great deal about, and it was a very important point that our audience has to really dictate the way that we apply feminist pedagogical principles. So when we say that the validation of personal experience, although all personal experience is obviously valid, we have to sort of assess, what do we mean by that? Do we mean giving voice, or do we mean challenging privilege and reassessing and helping people to learn or think in different ways, which isn't necessarily, which sometimes may come into conflict with feminist ideas and feminist principles about the nature of patriarchy, the nature of oppression, the nature of power relations. So I think that's a really important point, and I think that is definitely something that we need to go through and discuss more. And it's something that I'd invite, if anyone has any questions on this, so that we can discuss them at the end of the interview. Please keep sending them in on the questions tab. And something that's a bit related to this, well, quite related to this, is just the idea that, when we are training, especially in organizations, how do we resist the urge to oversimplify and depoliticize gender issues or gender analysis in order to meet a specific learning requirements? For example, in our last webinar, one of our speakers suggested that we need to play feminist, but we don't need to say it. So it's fair enough to say that maybe we don't need to explicitly call approaches that we take. We don't need to say that the pedagogies we're applying are feminist. But what happens when institutional pressure demands less of a focus on actual feminist pedagogical principles like critical learning or critical thinking, and focuses more around ticking boxes on staff skills or for gender analysis? How do we negotiate that? How do we resist that impulse?
I think that's kind of the million-dollar question. I think that's what we struggle with in our practice all the time. And I think this particular point is an area where we can see a bit more clearly the differences between adult education settings and training for gender equality settings. We're just looking at a whole different kinds of constraints, and I'm not suggesting that gender studies within universities are not bound by any constraints. Of course they are, but they're quite different to the ones which we find in a plurality of gender training settings. For example, the time-bound nature of gender training, the budgetary restraints. Well, you've only got 2 days, so you just have to do your best in 2 days, for example. The kind of political expectations of like what the institution needs to come out of this training. So I think what I try and do in the paper is think about supporting and providing some practical ways in which these principles can be integrated into the training cycle. And I think it's important that we bear the training cycle in mind rather than just think about pedagogical principles in the implementation phase, because it's impossible just to integrate the principles in the implementation phase. All phases are equally important, particularly in terms of the analysis and planning phase. We have to clearly argue, we have to say clearly, well, I understand that that you need practical tools and that you want something that's easy to apply. However, 20 years of research on gender mainstreaming has shown us that these kind of approaches simply don't work. So if you want to do something meaningful on gender equality, if you want to actually be able to demonstrate tangible change, then therefore we need to get into the more difficult questions. So it's about how these discussions are framed and how the importance of asking questions, not just answering questions, is included within all stages of the training cycle. In terms of curriculum development, there's a lot of material in the paper about that. How can we integrate this in curriculum development? And again, the same discussions. It's all very well and good to come out there suddenly a surprise feminist in the training scenario, but that's not going to really help, I don't think, in getting us to where we want to be. So we need to be more strong and more confident in the other phases when we're saying, right, we'll design the curriculum. No, I know that you want a checklist, but there's no point having a checklist unless the participants have first had a conversation about what some of these issues mean. So I think we need to be more confident in drawing on the theory and drawing on the experience that we have to say, well, that's just not going to work. And by demonstrating that we can't get anywhere with checklists, toolkits, or at least they need to be the end point. By demonstrating that, then we can show that we need to have this more critical approach, and that's the only way that we can lead to real change.
I agree. I think this echoes a lot of what came up in the last virtual dialogue on change. The idea that, one-off recipe training isn't the way, and it really is about, the continued sustained dialogue, especially with senior managers and especially with the people who make the decisions, to convince them that even if you want very short training sessions, this is a process, this is a learning process, this is something that needs to be followed up on and planned in advance, and needs to be more, we need to take into account the entire training cycle, not just, deliver, go in, talk about gender for half an hour and leave. That's not, that's not enough, and that's not enough certainly to bring about long-term change. And tying this in, because now what we're talking about is sort of, has a lot to do, I think, with face-to-face training, but I suppose it also has a lot to do with online training, which is, every day it's sort of growing as an aspect and something that we need to consider. And do you think that there are specific challenges of applying feminist pedagogies in online environments? Like, for example, applying participatory learning to an online environment when it has, certain constraints in terms of how participants can interact with each other and how they can, receive feedback, which may be delayed. Do you think that there's specific challenges in that sense?
Yeah, I don't think they're insurmountable, but I think a lot of this again depends on budgetary constraints and expectations, because I think that we have to also be careful to distinguish between self-paced courses and moderated courses, because we've got two very different things going on there. I think in a way moderated courses where you can have discussion groups and you have interactions with the instructor, that's the challenges are perhaps less clear there, although they probably follow some of the same challenges in general gender training. Nevertheless, the aspect of not being in the same physical space and not being able to explore those in a real-time way, yes, I do think that aspect of participatory learning is more challenging in a moderated group. But the self-paced, so perhaps we'll just stick with the self-paced for discussing these, because that's certainly where I have more experience and understanding. I think we can try with participatory learning. You do your best. You try to develop the exercises which draw on experiential aspects and leading to the second principle, the validation of personal experiences, encouraging reflection, and also, again, in the curriculum design, trying to understand really well the institution and the audience for which this course is designed. Get to know the institution, the gender dynamics, the kinds of people that will be taking the course, the various cultural aspects that need to be taken into account, so that it really speaks to that audience and they see themselves reflected in the course. So it's not just a kind of generic online training, but rather something that does draw on their personal experience. In terms of the encouragement of social justice, activism and accountability, again, this is tricky because you don't have that kind of ongoing debate, and if people are getting angry then from what they're learning and what the material they're engaged with, where do they go with it? So I think it's useful to always try and include further resources, further materials, and a module on what can you do, so trying to help people think about practical steps they can take after having taken the course. If they feel affected by the issues that they've been engaging with, then what can they do, and particularly what can they do within their organisation if the training course is for a specific organisation. So I think that's one way that we can work with that. In terms of critical thinking and open-mindedness, again, this is difficult because some people need more help with this, different cultural backgrounds, different educational backgrounds. In the UK, for example, where I went to school and did my degrees, then it's kind of critical thinking is very much embedded in the way that we learn, but that's not necessarily the same for all cultures. So that's something as well to think about when developing online training, because critical thinking isn't something that necessarily goes hand in hand with learning for all kinds of learners. So we need to think about how we can develop exercises that also sow the seeds of supporting critical thinking and open-mindedness.
I think these are very good points. When you've designed training courses in the past, is that something that you've, for example, when you're applying the feminist pedagogical principles in practice, when you're doing it for the design and everything, do you tailor the exercises then to, like, the participants' specific needs or specific cultures? For example, if you're doing it in the UK and you know that, for example, most of the people who have been educated here are going to have a sort of, almost default critical thinking, hat on, if you will, and they'll be able to really, cope with the material in this way. But how would we go about it if, for example, we're dealing with another culture where, because in a lot of cultures, in a lot of areas, rote learning is sort of the way to go, and critical thinking is sort of not exactly discouraged, but it's not perhaps cultivated in the way that it is in some cases. And I think perhaps sometimes even in organizations or institutional frameworks, people, when they're learning as a group, this maybe doesn't apply so much to online learning, but maybe more to face-to-face learning, they may be a bit reticent to be critical in front of, the people, the colleagues, people they work around, because maybe they don't want to show, they don't want to expose themselves, they don't want to give personal opinions. Is there a way that we can deal with this, either in face-to-face or online environments?
Well, I think that first of all, it helps to have a good course design and a good analysis and learning needs assessment phase, so that you really understand your learners and your participants and the ways that they're most likely to engage with the material, and then the importance as well of piloting a course. Does this work? Does this not? And sitting down with a wide range of people from the organisation. For example, if there's going to be support staff who aren't necessarily engaged in programming work and who haven't necessarily got higher degrees. So that's one example whereby we need to make sure that those people are also brought into the pilot stage to see how the materials and the exercises work in a practical way, and that means sitting down with people by their side while they're going through the materials. Does this work? Does this not work? I don't understand this. This doesn't make sense. So I think it's certainly not about designing an online platform, putting it out there, and then that's that. There has to be these iterative stages of development. But I think we've got a long way to go.
I think so too. But I think we've come a long way today. We've certainly discussed a lot of really important topics. No one has really sent in questions. People have sent in some comments saying that they really liked the interview. Ogbelayu from Dublin and Laura Martinez. Do either of you, Laura or Ogbelayu, would you like to send in a question? Because we've got a few minutes left. Well, we're almost done with time, but we've got a few minutes left. So if you have any questions, you can send those in, or I can remind you that you can post these on the CoP discussion forum, and we can ask Lucy to go on if she has time and
yeah, sure, that's fine. We can. I think that would be nice actually if you could open something on the CoP, and then we can put the paper link there, and maybe open a further discussion on that. And as I said, we're very open to comments and queries and responses to the paper, and any suggestions for the ways in which we can take this forward.
That's excellent. Yes, well, we reiterate Lucy's invitation that we'd like to hear what you have to say about the paper. What do you feel? What do you feel about the principles? Do you feel that there are more we should deal with? Do you feel these are too ambitious? I don't know, whatever you want to say, please come to the CoP discussion forum and discuss it. And So much, Lucy, for joining us today. That was, I think, a very successful, wonderful first interview in our series. And we'll be back on the 29th of June at the same time with Daniela Moreno, who is a gender trainer and is also going to be speaking about her experiences in face-to-face gender training and online gender training. And so we hope to see you all there. And thank you very much. And don't forget, please, to post your questions on the CoP platform. Thank you so much, Lucy.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.